Welcome to Rooted and Ready from Annie's Project, where we share real conversations about risk, resilience, and the decisions shaping agriculture. I'm your host, Karisha Devlin. I'm a farmer and training and curriculum officer with Annie's Project. Today we're talking about something that affects nearly every conversation in agriculture, data. Specifically, the Census of Agriculture and what it tells us about women in farming and ranching. Our guest is Dr. Katherine Dentzman. Dr. Dentzman is an assistant professor in rural sociology and rural public policy at Iowa State University. Her research focuses on women in agriculture, sustainability, identity, and the social side of agricultural systems. She's worked extensively with Census of Agriculture data to better understand who is farming in the United States and how the way we count farmers shapes the stories we tell about agriculture. If you've ever wondered why the numbers around women farmers seem to change so dramatically, or why representation in data matters, this conversation is for you. Welcome, Dr. Dinsman.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation. Before we hit record, I was sharing with you, fangirling a little bit, how much I appreciate your research and why it's so important to add to that body of work, particularly for me around women in agriculture. And you've spent a lot of time studying the social side of agriculture. What first drew you to that work?
That's a great question. And there's kind of a few answers to that. One of them is that I actually started in undergrad with an environmental science degree,
Okay.
and I was required to have a double major and chose sociology because I was starting to realize that I was actually more interested in the people side of the equation
Mm-hmm.
and why people did or did not use more sustainable practices, and how that was kind of influenced by the larger social context in which they found themselves. So, for instance, maybe people don't recycle because their city doesn't have a program,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that drew me to kind of the social side of environmental work. And then in grad school, I got into agriculture and I was hired on a project looking at the human dimensions of herbicide resistance. And I was working with a bunch of weed scientists, and we essentially had this question of, okay, we know what to do about herbicide resistance. Why aren't people actually doing it? What's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And that was really revolutionary for me because I got to go out into the field and do focus groups with farmers. And I came into it really thinking, like, yeah, why aren't they doing this? And then I actually talked to farmers and was like, oh, this is fascinating. Like they often do want to be doing things that would help manage herbicide resistance, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
but they have all of these contextual factors around them, all of these things that they're situated in our society and what uh, how that shapes basically their decision making that really fascinated me and gave me a lot of empathy for farmers and the difficult situations that they often find themselves in and how their decision making is constrained. And so that really got me going on the social side of ag and looking at kind of where farmers find themselves in society and how that shapes what they do.
So, building from there, what made you interested specifically in women in agriculture and agricultural demographics?
Yeah, so I was always interested in kind of how women might be farming differently.
Mm-hmm.
From my degree in environmental studies, I knew that women tend to, act more in terms of doing sustainable practices, recycling, things like this. And then I was very interested to see whether or not that same kind of trend transitioned onto the farm. I didn't really have time to do that during my dissertation, but I was able to get a postdoc at University of Idaho that was really focused on women farmers specifically.
Okay.
And I discussed there with Dr. Ryan Pilgrim, who is my advisor, about how really women's decision making around sustainability might be a lot more complex than I initially thought, and how women are a lot less homogenous, and women farmers in particular might be a lot more diverse in their decision making than necessarily how even I was thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that really fascinating, and that really drew me into the project.
That is fascinating. So, now we're going to kind of segue into the Census of Agriculture. And for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with it at all, what exactly is the Census of Ag?
Yeah, so the Census of Agriculture is one way that we can get a really good, at least fairly accurate picture of who farmers are and how farming is being done in the US. It is a census, right? So it's a survey that is intended to go out to every single farm in the US, and it's conducted once every 5 years. And some of the core information that it asks about stays the same, right? So, what kind of crops are you growing? What kind of farm products do you have? There's a decent number of questions in there about expenses and on farm practices, but there's also a section on demographics. And so, it is one of the major ways that we learn who the farmers in the United States are and basically how they're farming and how they're getting along in farming. So it's really, really valuable for those reasons.
I, One thing I think surprises people is how much influence the census has on the agricultural world just beyond statistics. Or I think even any of the censuses that are done in our country. My mother's big into genealogy, and so just the census that is taken every 10 years is huge for her research when she's going back, not only for our family, but for other families. And I really didn't realize how important it was until, discussing that with her. And that has changed my perspective when somebody comes and knocks on my door every 10 years and is asking these questions. I take it, more seriously. So I think the same thing can occur with the census of ag too, because it does affect a lot of things, uh,
Yeah, and
particularly like in who gets counted. But yes, I didn't mean to cut you off.
that's okay. I was just going to say it also, one of the great things, really interesting things about the census is it's been conducted since the 1800s.
Hmm.
So it also is a really important way of tracking how farming has changed in the US and really shapes our understanding of what farming looks like and who is involved in farming. Because otherwise, especially as more and more people move out of farming and don't have those connections, they don't actually see farmers in real life. This
Hmm.
really shapes their perspective on who is farming and what they're doing. And a lot of data that comes out of that really shapes that story in a lot of ways.
That is a perfect setup for the next question I was going to ask you, Dr. Dinsman. One of the changes that has taken place within the Census of Agriculture is how it has counted operators and principal farmers over time. So, can you explain that to us and break that down in some plain language?
Absolutely. And this is something that I spent a really long time when I was a postdoc trying to better understand. Because when they started counting farmers in the Census
Hmm.
of Agriculture, they initially were just counting one person. So they were saying who is in charge of this farm and collecting some demographic data on that person. How old are they? What's their level of education? What's their gender, etc. And so if you are a farm that was getting the census, you would choose one person to represent the farm. However, the Census of Agriculture, the folks who run it, did realize usually there's more than one person who is operating a farm, who is managing a farm, who is making on farm decisions. And so they started eventually, and I believe this was in like the early 2000s, that they added more people that you could list on the farm. So instead of just having one operator, they could list, you could, get the census form, and there were positions for you to list up to three operators. They still wanted you to identify who is most in charge, right?
Hmm.
Because that helps you compare to previous years. Who mostly runs the farm? Who is the main farmer? And so that gave you some legitimacy to compare it with the past years when they were just asking about one person. Then there were more changes where they started allowing you to list up to four farmers, and you could select any of the four as being a principal farmer. So moving away from just saying one person is in charge to recognizing that, yeah, there is often distributed decision making among the
Hmm.
farm. You may have some people who are more and less involved, and that was a way to indicate it. So that threw researchers and academics and even the USDA into a difficult situation where previously they had tracked the one principal operator on the farm to
Hmm.
determine, like, oh, this is a farm run by a woman. All of a sudden, we don't have that anymore. So they created a primary producer variable to try and identify who's most in charge. They
Okay.
actually no longer officially recommend that because they want to move away from that idea that just one person is
Mm-hmm.
really running a farm.
Do you think those changes ultimately gave us a more accurate picture of agriculture?
In a lot of ways, yes, because they were very considered changes. They actually had an entire advisory board
Mm-hmm.
review the processes when they decided to add a fourth person and to not identify one person as the single most in charge farmer. And that was really to try and recognize that realistically, that's not how farms work, that it's usually not just one person in charge. And so it is an attempt to more accurately reflect reality.
Mm-hmm.
However, it does throw a wide variety of little wrenches into the demographic data and into how we have historically understood, say, women in farming and
Mm-hmm.
women who are in charge of their farms. We don't have the same way of understanding that we used to. So there's a definite need for researchers to kind of adjust how they think about that.
You've spoke to this a little bit, but maybe we can delve into it some more, just about why the terminology changes matter so much for women in agriculture.
Absolutely. So, one of the reasons is that when you change the terminology, it changes the story,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this has really happened significantly when the census went from counting one person to three,
Mm-hmm.
and when they went from counting three people to four and not having a single producer per farm. So, when they went from one to three, suddenly you see this surge in the number of women farmers in the US, this massive explosion of
Right.
growth in the percent of women farming. And it's like, wow, what? You're counting two more people than you ever did.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those women already existed. You just weren't counting them before.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the story that gets picked up doesn't reflect that. And the story that gets picked up is, wow, there's been a huge surge in women getting into farming.
Okay.
So there's sometimes a misunderstanding of that
Right.
data.
Mm-hmm.
Same kind of thing with when they went to counting four people and when they went to counting any of them as principal operators, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to formally counting one. Well, suddenly we have this surge in women farmers again. We have this surge in women principal operators. And it's really hard to disentangle. Is that actually reflecting a true growth in the number of women in farming? Or is
Mm-hmm.
it just because we're counting them differently? Because
Mm-hmm.
we added these additional slots for those women who already existed to be acknowledged.
What do you wish people understood before quoting census statistics?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things is that the census really is making a best effort to accurately reflect what's going on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
That is why they've made these changes. Sometimes people can accuse them of trying to just make themselves look better, but from the research that I've done, the discussions I've had with the census, they really are making a good faith effort to try and accurately represent people on farms. Given that, I think you also really need to try and understand how changes in data shape the narrative, right? So if you see this massive growth where it's like, wow, the number of women farmers in the US jumped by 30% in the last 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
take a second and think about what the reasons for that might be. And if those reasons are actually like social, that it makes sense, wow, so many more women in farming, or could it be a reflection of the data?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so looking a little bit at the methodology is just really, really helpful. And I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but me and some of my collaborators have written some hopefully fairly accessible articles
You
to
should
help
toot your
understand.
horn.
Thank you. Because it is confusing, right? It is really
It,
confusing data. It took me
mm-hmm.
a really long time to figure it out, being a postdoc, spending 100% of my time on this. So part of our goal in writing these articles was that other people wouldn't have to spend that much
Mm-hmm.
time to understand the methodology.
What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about women in agriculture?
Oh boy. I think one of the biggest things, and this was actually a misconception that I kind of referenced at the beginning of the interview,
Mm-hmm.
is that women are kind of a homogenous group. And I really had to kind of reframe how I thought about that when I got into this project. Because I think, even I, coming from a social science perspective, kind of thought, oh, women farmers, we understand those people as a collective. They
Mm-hmm.
all have similar traits, they all want similar things. And really getting to work with Dr. Pilgrim and dive into the Census of Agriculture really helped to show me that that's not necessarily always the case. And that some of these narratives we have about women on farms are really broad generalizations that don't capture the actual realities. So I'll give a quick example.
Sure.
We tend to think that women farmers are much more likely to farm organic, right? Kind of going back to this
Mm-hmm.
stereotype we have about
Yes,
sustainability and women
that's
farmers being more
something I've
sustainable.
heard. Yes.
Absolutely, right? And so I was really interested in looking into this. Are they actually farming more organic?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the statistics from the Census of Agriculture, it turns out that they are, but it's a much smaller difference than you might think.
Okay.
So if you look at the percent of men farming organic, it's about 1.7%. The percent of women is about 2%. So are they more likely? Yes. But there's still 98% of women farmers who are not farming
Mm-hmm.
organically. So there's really a lot of nuance that you have to start to understand there. And I think it's really interesting how data and numbers can kind of show us like where these stereotypes come from and how there's a seed of truth in a lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
but also how women farmers are actually a lot more diverse than that and have a
Mm.
lot of other interests and are involved in farming in ways that sometimes don't fit the cultural narrative or the cultural stereotype.
So building on that, your research talks about policy and programming often assuming that there's one universal woman farmer, just like you just said, like all women
Mhm.
farm organically. Uh, and you've mentioned how that can be limiting. In what other ways could having that kind of thought process be limiting to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we were finding in our data is that, yeah, women farm really differently. And this is actually something that I try and emphasize in my class. So, I teach a human diversity in agriculture class here at Iowa
Okay.
State. And we talk about our perceptions of women farmers and how different a lot of groups of women farmers
Mm-hmm.
are, and how that means that they have very different needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a policy that you're thinking that might support women farmers, but you're maybe thinking about just a broad universal women farmer, is actually leaving a lot of people behind. So, for instance, if you think about, oh, okay, women farmers in Iowa, they might be part of a family farm doing corn and soybeans. They might be covered by some policies that, for instance, a Native American Navajo women farmer in Arizona who is raising sheep primarily for wool, for textile crafts,
Mm-hmm.
would not be covered at all, right?
Right.
And so you might think, wow, I'm really helping women farmers, but you're actually missing this entire demographic. And I bring up that example partly because they're a really large group, surprisingly, of women farmers. If you look at women farmers who are listed as the principal, and if you look at
Mm-hmm.
non-white women farmers, it's like 14% who are Navajo women in Arizona raising sheep. So it's not just this random example that I'm grabbing, but it
Mm-hmm.
is actually a fairly substantial population who could really benefit from a lot of policy that wouldn't reach them if we're just thinking about women farmers as people who are, say, growing corn and soybeans.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I- I've discovered just in my career that has been interesting, but also it challenges me to think a little more broadly is just also the the names that we give folks. So, for instance, in our discussion, we've talked a lot about women farmers, but we have some women who are involved in agriculture that they don't see themselves as farmers; they see themselves as ranchers, or they see themselves as
Yes.
growers. And
Hmm.
I remember this has been several years ago. I was at a meeting. I was doing a training for a group of folks that were going to be Annie's project facilitators, and I talked about women being partners, and
Yeah.
they did not like that word at all. And they were like, that word in our state, women would be offended by that. You know, don't call women partners in their ag operation. So I was like, oh, because where I live, that is not a word that would trigger somebody. So it's a reminder about the labels that you
Mhm.
use and how that affects people, how that comes across. And I think, yeah, kind of just going back to one universal woman farmer, it makes sense to me that isn't the case, that we all have a broad range of identities and the way we look at things and the way
Mhm.
that we're involved in agriculture.
Absolutely. And not all women farmers have the same views, the same identities,
Correct.
the same
Correct.
perspectives on what they
Yeah.
want to be called, right? Or how they
Right.
want to be represented. And so I think it's really important to kind of think about that representation and make
Hmm.
sure that we're not painting with too broad a brush and really hiding these complex identities and views that women.
Absolutely. In the data that you've looked at and involved in your research, what does it tell us about women's leadership and decision making roles on their farms or ranches or ag operations?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually a really cool topic in the Census of Agriculture, looking at the data. So there's a couple questions that can kind of get at leadership and decision making. Obviously, we can't go talk to these women directly. We just
Hmm.
have the census data. So women were less likely to be chosen as a principal operator, less likely to be marked as a principal operator than men.
Hmm.
So that tells us a little bit about how they maybe view themselves on farms or viewed on farms. But at the same time, there's a series of questions about the different kinds of decisions that each producer makes on the farm. And there are
Okay.
things like land use decisions, livestock decisions, cropping decisions, estate and record keeping decisions, bookkeeping, all of this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And when you look at the farmers who are listed first and second, so the people who are probably the most active farm managers, it does not matter if that person is a man or a woman. They are involved in every single aspect of decision making on the farm.
Hmm.
It's like 100%, where if you are listed first or second, you are making decisions on the farm about everything. You
Hmm.
are involved in some capacity in those decisions. It's when we get to positions 3 and 4 that we tend to see a little bit more gender difference appearing,
Okay.
where men who are kind of further down the list of farmers on the farm tend to be more involved in those cropping and livestock decisions, and women tend to be more involved in the record keeping and estate planning decisions.
Hmm.
We don't necessarily know why. It could be parents on the farm who are still helping out in some capacity.
Hmm.
But I think it was really interesting to see that if you're in one of those two primary roles on the farm, you're involved in every decision no matter what.
Interesting. I hope from our conversation that people really understand the importance of census data because it affects so many things. But if you were going to leave a parting thought, what should everyday farmers and ranchers think about? Why should they care about ag census data? Especially
Yeah,
when they get that piece of paper in the mail and, they're not like tossing it on their desk or tossing it in the trash, that they're actually taking the time to fill that out.
yeah, it's not very fun to fill out. It's a pretty long form, and I know that people can be a little frustrated with that. And there's definitely been news lately too about decreasing trust in USDA data
Hmm.
and USDA questionnaires. I think that some of the strongest evidence I have for the importance of agricultural census data is really just my class and how sharing data affects my students.
Hmm.
Um, so in this class, one of the first things I have them do is draw a picture of a farmer. And this is at the very beginning. I ask them, okay, we're basically going to play Pictionary. You're going to draw a couple things for me. I have them draw a couple generic things, and then I have
Hmm.
them draw a farmer. And it's really striking the farmers that my students draw. I'd
Please tell
say
me it's not the overalls and the
it
piece of.
is.
Okay, I cannot stand that. Oh, that's like a pet peeve of mine. That's like the
It's so
vision people
funny.
have of farmers. Okay.
And
But it is.
these
Okay.
are often students that actually are very familiar with agriculture,
Right.
and they still tend to draw a man, number one,
Yeah.
A man in overalls and a plaid shirt and boots with a hat, maybe with a straw in his mouth.
You're
Maybe
right.
they draw some corn nearby, something like this, right? And I ask them, does this actually represent farmers that you know? And they're
Hmm.
like, oh, no, it doesn't. I'm like, well, then why did you draw it?
Right.
Because that's the stereotype that we,
Hmm.
right? That is the representation that we see. That is our cultural narrative about
Right.
who a farmer is. And then I start to show them the data. Who actually are farmers?
Hmm.
Who do you actually see in your day-to-day life? But also, if you don't have any experience in agriculture, look at this data and tell me, is the data showing you the person that you drew, right? And in a lot of cases, it's not. And it
Hmm.
starts to give us this more complex notion. And I start to get into ideas of representation and the importance of
Right.
representation and how it can limit people and limit their opportunities and how we can treat people differently based on this assumption of who a farmer is. But
Hmm.
I think that data has a lot of power to challenge that and a lot of power to affect how the broader public and how agricultural students, for
Hmm.
instance, see farmers and understand who they are. So, from my perspective, that's part of why the census data is so important
Hmm.
because it really does give us the opportunity to kind of challenge some traditional notions about farming and who farmers are and see farmers in a different light. So, having accurate representation, I think, really matters. And census of ag data is one way to do that.
What a great exercise for your students. Just to, yeah, challenge them to look at things differently, and a really great way to drive home that example. Uh,
Thank you. And
Wish
some
we
of
could.
them do draw tractors. Some of them get a little creative with it. Somebody drew a combine once.
Oh,
So,
wow.
those
Oh,
people are out there,
right.
but the narrative is persistent. Yeah.
What gives you hope when you look at the future for women in agriculture?
That's a great question too. And, not to repeat myself too much, but my students do. I
Hmm.
have a lot of women students
Yeah.
who come from farms and who want to be involved in agriculture to some degree. And they inspire me. They impress me. They're curious. They're driven. They want to understand what's going on in agriculture.
Hmm.
They want to shape it. They want to have an influence on the future of agriculture. And I just find that really beautiful. Um, and so I really appreciate that. And that gives me a lot of hope. And then some of the other things are also just seeing women's creativity,
Hmm.
right? Um, some of the data that I've looked at and looks at women at different farm scales, right? And it's really interesting to see that farms that tend to be more run by men and farms that tend to be more run by women, even within the same kind of income bracket, they tend to have very different strategies on those farms. Men's farms that are very high income tend to be larger acreage, tend to be more like grain crops and commodity
Hmm.
crops. Women's tend to be a bit smaller acreage and more often focus on animal agriculture. So
Okay.
it's really interesting to see how women farmers are creative with the resources and the
Hmm.
skills that they have and the opportunities available to them and can use those to achieve success in ways that are sometimes different. So the creativity, the resilience, and my students, those all give me a lot of
I agree that it is very heartwarming, inspiring to see young women going into agriculture. You see a lot of our College of Ags across the country. The ratio of men to women is maybe the same. Even in some cases, there's more women that are enrolling in the College of Ag, and it's awesome to see that. I'm
hope.
curious as well. Something you said triggered this question about technology and
Mm,
how it's going to play a role for women in ag. I had read an article several years ago that's always stuck with me that talked about how the invention of the plow had been the turning point for some of women, and that, and still in a lot of countries around the world, women are the ones that are the farmers. They're the ones that are planting the seeds. They're out there every day. And then in I guess the modern or more advanced countries with the plow came into place, it kind of became a more strength related, like you needed strength and kind of that started maybe changing that that story that we have about who can
Mhm.
farm. And this article kind of circled it back around to technology about how strength is not needed. It's not a factor in
Mhm.
agriculture anymore, and that just more things are automated and technology is kind of maybe leveling the playing field, so to speak. Have you had any saw any research, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that in a lot of ways, technology is leveling the playing field
Mm-hmm.
and making farming in some ways more accessible. I do think one of the important things to consider is the scale of the
Mm-hmm.
technology and what sort of farm scales technology is being developed for.
Mm-hmm.
This is a big conversation, right? Is technology being developed that only suits very large farms, that is only economically relevant on very
Right.
large farms?
Mm-hmm.
And women tend to have smaller farms.
Mm-hmm.
So is that going to affect them in the same way? There's also kind of the stereotype of, men being more technological,
Mm-hmm.
um, doing better in math classes or, being better with computers, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So I think that there still are some of these cultural stereotypes
Mm-hmm.
that can be limiting in terms of how women engage with technology.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, definitely how we define farming as physical labor versus a kind of more businessman technological
Mm-hmm.
profession is shifting. And even in, computer science, we're seeing a lot more women enter computer science. So I think that it is shifting the playing field in a lot of ways. But I think that it's also important as we're designing these technologies and as people are coming out with these innovations to think about these things and to
Mm-hmm.
think about how these technologies will fit on larger small farms, on smaller farms. Are they accessible to everyone in the
Mm-hmm.
same?
Yeah, it's yes, I could keep talking to you. We could go deep dive into a lot of directions. But to circle us back to the conversation about the Census of Ag and the data
Mhm.
that is available through it and just our overall discussion today, what's one thing that you hope the listeners can take away from our conversation?
Oh boy. I mean, I'm definitely an advocate for data and the power of data and
Mm-hmm.
understanding how useful it can be. But at the same time, the necessity of trying to understand the methodology and
Mm-hmm.
where it comes from, right? Um, so I think that the importance of data is definitely one thing, but also just representation. I think data is one way that we can represent farmers and women farmers and who they are. But there are lots of other ways to represent
Mm-hmm.
women in agriculture other than just raw data.
Mm-hmm.
And we see lots of different women representing themselves and advocating for themselves in different ways. So I guess that brings me back to that idea of women not being homogenous. Data is one way to see that,
Mm-hmm.
but there's lots of other ways to see that as well. And actually having conversations with women farmers and going out there and getting their perspectives is also extraordinarily valuable. And there's a wealth of qualitative research out there that does give women farmers a direct voice and
Mm-hmm.
interviews them and asks them their perspective and their thoughts. So I think we need both, right? And I hope that more people understand the diversity of women out there and that all of those perspectives have a place in agriculture.
Dr. Dentzman, thank you so much for joining us and helping us to better understand the stories behind the statistics. I think one of the biggest takeaways from today is that data matters because what gets counted shapes who gets seen, supported, and included in agriculture's future. And for listeners, maybe this conversation is also a reminder that every farm and ranch story is different, and every voice matters in the bigger picture of agriculture. If you would like a deeper dive and more insights from Dr. Dentzman, check out the Annie's Conversation, What Can the U.S. Census of Agriculture Tell Us About Women Farmers in the U.S.? It's an hour-long webinar and it really has some great information in it. So you can access that on the Annie's Project YouTube channel. Thanks for listening to Rooted and Ready from Annie's Project, where we learn, share, and grow together. If this conversation was meaningful to you, subscribe, share the episode, and pass it along to someone else in agriculture. Until next time, stay rooted and ready.